Welcome to the Q Podcast.
Q is about conversation.
If we're really concerned about ending poverty, we've got to be more concerned about creating justice.
Our cultural products as Christians need to both defy and resonate with the culture.
And God's doing amazing things. His church is expanding, His church is growing.
It's not what's the purpose of my life, it's what is the purpose that's been assigned.
Stay curious, think well, advance good. This is Q.
Welcome back to the Q Podcast. I'm Gabe Lyons, and continuing on with what we've been doing these last several episodes, you're going to get to hear a great 9-minute conversation that we had around the topic of foster care and adoption. And what's unique about this conversation is I was talking with a couple who joined us, Brian and Julie Mavis, who God has called both into this space in different ways, but who together are working to advance a significant movement in American life and in the church as well as in government to start to see those who are part of the foster care system start to find families. And so as they advocate, they really represent so many other organizations as well, and people and churches and pastors and Christians who have gotten on board in the last decade in a significant way with what God's doing to reawaken the church to adoption and foster care. And so I can't wait for you to hear their story and to hear how they did it, to hear what significant results they've already seen from following what God put in front of them to do. And I hope it inspires you. So let's listen into this conversation with Brian and Julie Mavis. Julie, how did you first get into this whole idea of foster care? How did this encounter you?
Well, we were foster parents for 5 years. And during that time, one of the little babies that we had, he was addicted to drugs. And we brought him home from the hospital and had him for 9 months. And during that time, the caseworker called and said, I need to come over. I need to talk. Something has happened with this case. And so I said, come on over. And she shared that something had gone wrong and he wasn't going to be going back to his birth parents, but he was going to go up for adoption and wanted to know if we would adopt. And I was interested, but at the same time, I just had questions and just said, what would happen if I said no? What happens to this little guy? And she said, there's a whole line just waiting for the babies. I just wish there was a line waiting for all the other kids. I was like, well, what other kids? She said, in Colorado alone, there's over 800 kids available for adoption, and nobody knows about these kids, and nobody picks them. And it was just an injustice. It was unacceptable. And I just kept thinking, well, somebody needs to do something about this. And then really felt called to try to do something about it. So what we ended up doing is, since these kids were forgotten and nobody knew about them, we decided to photograph the kids and videotape them and use professional photographers and videographers to give them a face and a voice, to connect them with families. And we mainly worked in churches, and combining the visual arts and the churches was amazing.
That's awesome.
Yeah, we actually have one example. Here's a picture of a couple of girls, Lily and Samaya. So they've been in foster care for 3 years, legal orphans, waiting to be adopted. And no one knew about them. And within a month of getting their picture taken and shown in a church, they were chosen and have been adopted now for several years by their forever family. That's just one example of this happening hundreds of times.
So tell us about the story, Brian, with America's Kids Belong, where something that's been happening in Colorado is now starting to spread to other states. And you've kind of added to not just a grassroots model, but you've gotten strategic about how you're doing it. Would you first just kind of update us on the Colorado story? Yeah. Where's that at right now?
So when we started, as Julie said, there was over 800 kids in Colorado who were legally free to be adopted. We're down to 280 now. And that was
Isn't that amazing?
That was
Isn't that awesome?
Church movement.
Yeah.
Yeah. So the church is a hero in that for sure. But about a year and a half ago, we out of Chicago had a business team reach out to us, led by Joe Ritchie, Tim Shirk, and Laura Doherty. And they had done some research, and they really encouraged us to say, why don't you take this to other places, and we're going to be a part of your team, and we'll help be that leg on the stool that helps business. But they said, we really still need not just grassroots and business, we need a grass tops approach to a political advocate. And I said, actually, I know the right person. I was an acquaintance with Janet Kelly and her husband, Ryan, Janet was Secretary of State of Virginia. And a few years ago, she was attending her church, and that church had talked about there being over 1,000 kids who were legally free in Virginia who needed adopting. It was news to her. She went back to her governor, her boss, the next day and said, "Did you know there's 1,000 kids who need adopting in Virginia?" And he was like, "No, I had no idea." And she was like, "Yeah, you're their dad." And so, and he's like, "Well, take care of it." So they did a campaign called Virginia Adopts. And in the last year of their administration, they matched over 1,000 kids to their adoptive families, which was a 50% increase over the year before. And so we just married all these approaches together for a first of its kind approach that we do these multi-sector, multi-year campaigns. So now when people ask me, "So what do you do?" When I'm sitting on a plane and someone asks, I just resigned from being a pastor a couple weeks ago, so that helps. And then I said, I train elephants, and our team trains elephants. And what I mean by that is there's an African proverb that says, when two elephants fight, it's the grass that suffers. And so there's the elephant of the government and the elephant of the church. They have been fighting, and it's the kids who are suffering for it. There's the elephant of elephant of business and elephant of creative. And we train them all to come and work together for the sake of the kids. And that's awesome. And that's our story.
Well, and Julie, you've just been amazing at overcoming a lot of the misconceptions people have about foster care. Could you clear up just what are some of the top ones you found? Because I've heard, not just from Brian, but from others, you're the top recruiter of parents for foster care. So if you're listening right now, you better get ready because this girl knows how to do it. And tell us, what do we not understand about it?
Yeah. One of the biggest one is that adoption through foster care is really expensive. And most people have in their head international costs, which is anywhere from $20,000 to $50,000. But if you're adopting through the foster system, it's virtually free. So that's one of the biggies. The second one is, oh my gosh, kids in foster care, they're naughty. They did something. But it's actually what's been done to them, what happened to their parents. The parents are either in jail or they abandoned the kids or abused the kids. So it's nothing that the kids did.
Right.
So, and I think the third one for sure is if you want to care for orphans, you need to go to another country and work on an orphanage, and which I did for years actually and loved it. But during that time, meeting a lot of the kids and talking to directors, at the orphanage, asking questions of why these kids were in care and what happened to their parents. How did all the parents die? And they were saying, they're not dead. They're actually, a lot of the parents are just in jail or they've abandoned the kids or in prison. And the connection is definitely just in other countries, we call it orphanages. And in the United States, we call it the foster care system.
How many of you in this room would raise your hand that you, in some point in your adult history, you've either fostered or been an adoptive family? Would you just raise your hand? Look around the room. Wow. It's just beautiful. Thank you. I think, Brian, this is one of those areas, we talk about a lot of cultural issues and current issues and the church constantly, getting things wrong. This is one of those areas where there's incredible opportunity for the church in our society to make steps forward and to show people what God's love looks like when it really shows up. And I know that's your heart. That's why you're leading America's Kids Belong. It had never existed. I mean, nothing like this has ever been created. I know there's churches in here. I know some of the pastors who've created these kind of movements in their churches, and it's flourishing. I want them to meet you, number one. So please find them today to have a conversation. But could you just tell us a little bit about how can people get involved? What's the strategy look like right now for how you're trying to approach this?
Yeah, actually, I think where I would encourage you is just to start with your heart and believe a few things. First of all, just believe that this is unacceptable, that there are kids who feel like nobody wants them. There's 400,000 of those kids in the United States that they feel like they don't belong, they're not loved. And so and believe it, the outcomes are horrible too for kids who don't get connected to a family. It's a gateway to sex trafficking, homelessness, addiction, crisis pregnancy. And so believe this is unacceptable. we're trying to pray and do and work that God's will be done on earth as it is in heaven. There are no orphans in heaven. So we work towards that. Second, believe that this is solvable. This is a huge problem. The church is even bigger, though. And so, for example, we've doing this full campaign in Oklahoma, and they're already, we've been there 5 months. They've already increased recruitment 90% statewide. I also want to give a shout out to Church of the City in Tennessee. They have 23 families in their entire county who are foster families. And last week they started this and they preached about this. In the first 48 hours, they had over 200 people sign up saying they want to learn more about being foster families.
Yeah.
And then lastly, this is an expression of the pure gospel, that this isn't just a social movement. This is a way to express reconciliation, helping kids get into their families. Mm-hmm. It's a way to adopt kids and express that us being adopted by God. And lastly, it requires a step of faith. This requires risk to have a kid and come to your family. And no matter how fearful that sounds, imagine how scary it is to be a kid who's taken from their family, is getting pushed around to other families. These kids have taken too many risks now. It's time for the grown-ups to step up and take the risk so the kids don't have to anymore.
I love it. Let's give them a hand for their faithful work. Thank you, guys. Thank you so much. Thanks, brother. Pretty fun to just listen to Brian and Julie as a team work on such a big cause, something that feels so large, and you can actually see through their story how one by one children are starting to find families and more states are getting involved. And so if you're interested in getting involved with them, go to americaskidsbelong.org so that you can see more about if they're working in your state yet, and if they're not, how you could actually maybe be the advocate that helps bring them to your state and get them involved with the churches in your area. It's significant work. It's important work. This is the kind of work that really not only changes culture long term, but it really changes people's lives and transforms their experience. It's one of the greatest demonstrations of Christian love and of really showing the world how much our faith leads us to do things that help people, that aren't just about necessarily an opinion or a political belief or something like that, but it's actually making a radical difference in people's lives by sacrificing and stepping forward and say, we want to be a part of what God wants to do in this child's life. I hope you'll join us again next week. We're going to listen in on another conversation that took place at Q that I think will encourage and challenge you in the same way this did.